Hello, everyone. Today I would like to present Josephus Flavius' texts about the sects of Judaism during the Second Temple period. In my opinion, Second Temple period has been a very important period of time in, I say, human civilization because it had a very important impact on monotheistic religions as we understand them today. And Josephus' descriptions of the different sects, whether the Pharisees, Sadducees, or Essenes, are very important in order to understand the difference between the three groups and the impact that they have left on us until today. And so what I would like to do is go straight to the text, go straight to the source, and go straight to the source and read what he had said about the different sects of Judaism. And I just need to share a document. Just a second. So yeah, I'm sharing it, and I will activate it. In a second, the moment it will let me do that. Here you are, hopefully. Okay, so Josephus Flavius on the sects of Second Temple Judaism. So first, who was Josephus Flavius? So Josephus Flavius was born as Yosef ben Matityahu in Jerusalem. He was a Jewish soldier, one of the rebels against Rome. And the rebellion failed, Rome won the war, and Josephus Flavius, or Yosef ben Matityahu, was taken as a prisoner. He was actually a general in the Jewish army. He fell. Beitar fell, and he was the commander of Beitar. And unlike some rebels, which he wrote about, that decided to commit suicide and not to fall into the hands of Rome, because then they will turn into slaves, Josephus decided to surrender and he became a slave. Just as he anticipated, he became a slave to a master called Flavius. And Flavius, over time, he identified that Josephus as unique, is a unique person, and he set him free. And Josephus took the Flavius name from his master's name, so this is why he's called Josephus, Joseph Flavius. Flavius is the master's name. And he wrote two important books about the history of the Jews, which are called The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. So he was the person in Rome to tell the Roman people about this strange religion called Judaism, which has been rebellious, why they've been rebellious. And we have to understand that he had to explain Judaism to the Roman, audience. So to take some allegories and take some things that Romans can understand in order to explain Judaism to them. So he wrote about Judaism, the teachings of Judaism, but mostly he wrote about the history of the Jews. And it's been an important source about that period of time, but it's not the only source that we have about that period of time. The fall of Jerusalem, we're talking about the first century after during Common Era, yes. So the first like 100 years of Judaism is not the only source that we have about the sects of Judaism. So things that he wrote can be compared with things that others like in the Talmud and other sources have been written about that period of time. And so at first, for many years, he was highly esteemed by Christians. Jews didn't pay too much attention to Josephus over the generations. And because in some versions of his book, there is a reference to Jesus. Now scholars think that this reference was forged during like monks over the years, kind of when they were handwriting his book from, from scroll to scroll, added some text about Jesus. And so people don't think it's authentic to Josephus now, what he has written about Jesus. But anyways, but nowadays scholars do think that Josephus can be a reliable resource to understand, Second Temple Judaism and what he wrote about the sects of Judaism. So what I'll do is I'm going to read the text, what he wrote about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and then at the end I'll do some kind of a comparison between all the three groups. Okay, so I'm starting with the Pharisees, and I'm actually going to start with the last text, Josephus Antiques, chapter 13, verse 297, 98. And I'm going to start, it's called the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and I will start with that. For the present, I wish merely to explain that the Pharisees has passed on to the people certain regulations handed down by former generation are not recorded in the laws of Moses, which are the reason they are rejected by the Sadducees group, who hold that only those regulations should be considered valid which were written down in the scriptures, and that those who has been handed down by former generations need not be observed. So what he says here in this paragraph is basically that the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees has to be with what we call the oral law. The oral law was adopted by the Pharisees. Yes, they adopted a set of regulations and rules that are not written in the Bible, and they are like co-equal to the Bible, what later on will be called, the Talmud. Um, the Pharisees have been like the first ones to develop these like sets of regulations and laws and stories that later on became very dominant in Jewish culture, while the Sadducees rejected them because they are not written in the Bible. So we can say that Sadducees were just like biblical literalists. If it's in the Bible, they follow. If it's not in the Bible, they don't. And this has been a major difference between the two groups. Um, So I'm continuing from verse 298, and concerning these matters that the two parties came to have controversies and serious differences, the Sadducees have been confident in the wealthy alone, but no following among the populace, while the Pharisees have the support of the masses. So this is something we also know. The Sadducees were the temple elite, were the priests, and they had this like a small group of wealthy people who were, mostly relate around temple sacrifice, while the Pharisees have been more popular in among the people. So this is also something we know from other sources. Now, I'm going to go now to the first paragraph that starts with the letter 12. The Pharisees simplified their standard of living, making no concessions to luxury. They follow the guidance, that of which their doctrine has selected and transmitted as good, attaching the chief importance to the observance of those commandments which it has seemed fit to dedicate to them. They show respect and deferences to their elders, nor do they rashly presume to contradict their proposals. Okay, so they said that they are simple, humble people. Now, an interesting paragraph. Though they postulate that everything is brought about by fate, still they do not deprive the human will of the pursuit of what is in man's power, since it was God's pleasure that there should be a fusion, and that the will of man with his virtue and vice should be admitted to the council chamber of fate. So what he's saying here is, and he's going to talk about this with all the groups, it's the tension between the ideas of predestination compared with the ideas of free will. Is everything written by God, or we have control over our destiny? So what he says here about Pharisees, that they believe that everything is brought by fate, meaning they believe in predestination. God sets the rules, But men still have some power. Yes, so it's predestination with some powers for free will. Now, the second argument, with verse 14, they believe that the souls have the power to survive death, and there is a reward and punishment under the earth, not in heaven, under the earth, for those who have led lives of virtue or vice. Internal imprisonment is the lot of evil souls, while the good souls receive an easy passage to a new life. So basically, what he says here about Pharisees is that Pharisees believe in afterlife and in reward and punishment. Those who receive punishment, they get to be imprisoned in the prison of evil souls. Maybe we can call it hell. Yes, a different word is hell. While good souls receive an easy passage to a new life. And he will repeat it a few times later, that Pharisees believed in reincarnation. Now, we don't have any source to support it. And what we believe is that he was speaking to a Roman audience and he explained those terms to Roman audiences in the language they understood. I think what he meant here is there's some kind of heaven and hell kind of like solution in which, after you die, if you're evil, you go to hell. If you are good, you go to some kind of heaven, like he will repeat it again and again, reincarnation. We don't really agree with that. We'll see later on another explanation of heaven by a different group, which looks different. So we would say reincarnation. This is what he says. Probably he wasn't correct about that. It should have been some kind of heaven. Uh, was the Pharisee belief in the afterlife? So not everyone is going to heaven, of course. It's either if you're good, heaven; if you're bad, hell. Now, let's go read what he says about the Sadducees. So again, I remind you, the Sadducees were a small group that were temple elite. They were the priests and people around them. And they believed we already know, just in the written law, they didn't accept the oral law. And now this is what Sadducees believe in when it comes to afterlife and, things of that sort. The Sadducees hold that the soul perishes along with the body. They owe no observance of any sort apart from the laws. In fact, they reckon in a virtue to dispute with the teachers of the path of the wisdom they pursue. There are but few men whom this doctrine has been made known, but these men are of the highest standing. These are the elite. They accomplish practically nothing, however, for wherever they assume some office, though they submit unwillingly and perforce, yet submit they do the formulas of the Pharisees, since otherwise the masses will not tolerate them. So we see he didn't like the Sadducees. He spoke ill of them. Nobody likes them. Nobody listens to them. But they are the elite. You can see the dislike that he had toward the Sadducees. But something interesting that he says, remember that Pharisees believed in some kind of, heaven and hell kind of formula. He says the Sadducees did not believe in that. When you die, it's over. There's no soul. It doesn't go to afterlife. It ends. It ends there. Now, I'll continue reading the next paragraph. The Sadducees, the second of the order, do always do away with faith altogether and remove God beyond not merely the commission, but the very sight of evil. Okay, they maintain that man has the free choice of good or evil and that it rests with each man will whether he follows one or the other. As for the presence of the soul after death, penthesiles in the underworld and rewards, they have none to them. The Pharisees are affectionate to each other and cultivate harmonious relations with the communities The Sadducees, on the contrary, are even among themselves rather boorish in their behavior and in their intercourse with their peers. They are rude and to the aliens. Such is what I have about to say on the Jewish philosophical school. Okay, so let's kind of unpack what he said here. So we already saw him in the previous paragraph says, after you die, Sadducees do not believe that there is anything waiting for you. There's no afterlife. And he says it again, and he says it again. They do away with fate, meaning they do not believe in predestination and remove God beyond not merely the commission, but the very sight of evil. So this is a philosophical question, if he's all powerful, if God is all, if God is responsible for everything, then is he also responsible for evil? Is also responsible for bad deeds? And so they say they completely remove him from any type of evil making. They say that man has free choice to be good or evil, but you're not supposed to be good because heaven is waiting for you when you die. This is not the reason from the Sadducees' perspective, to be good. So there's not like a carrot, that kind of incentivize you to be good according to the Sadducees. It's just you want to be good because you want to follow God's laws, and they are very strict about God's laws. You want to follow God's laws, and therefore you want to be good. And this is the only thing. You have free choice. You can be evil, you can be good, and it doesn't going to matter for the afterlife. It's just going to matter for this life. Yeah, and then but the next paragraph again, he shows his dislike to the Sadducees, portraying them as people that are mean and evil, and they are not even friends with one another. Nobody likes them. Now, on the Essenes, Josephus wrote a long paragraph. I didn't bring everything to this text because it's long, but the Essenes have been the most curious group of all, because, Pharisees and Sadducees lived together in Jerusalem and in other parts of the country. The Essenes had been a very small group of people who renounced the world and decided to move to the desert and to live by the Dead Sea. If you are familiar with the topography, the Jordan River, in the 1950s, their library was found in the caves of Qumran. If you are familiar with the topography of Israel, it's very close to the Dead Sea. It's really dry area. And from their library that was found, we can learn a lot about them. This was a small group of people, of world renouncers, people that decided to leave Jerusalem because they thought Jerusalem was corrupt. They were living in the desert. They thought that the Messiah is going to come. And they were just waiting for the Messiah, living the simple life, communal life, and just praying and worshiping and preparing themselves. Also, it was a community of just men. There were no women among the Essenes, just men. And the significance of the Essenes, besides the curiosity of this like strange cult, basically a sect, a cult of, weirdos, so to say, weirdos, um, their significance lies far beyond their numbers because we believe that probably Jesus was somehow influenced by this group. And he was influenced by all of these groups, by the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, But when we read about the Essenes, according to way Josephus is telling us, is we see the blueprint of them on Jesus' teachings. And we also know John the Baptist was also among those communities of the people who were living next to the Jordan River. And therefore, from taking all of this together, suddenly the Essenes, this small group of people that kind of lived in the desert, were waiting for the end of the times to come and has suddenly developed a much bigger role in the history of of that period of time, just because of their influence over the teachings of Jesus. Yes, that's the connection. So this is what Josephus have said about the Essenes. The doctrine of the Essenes is want to leave everything in the hands of God. They regard the soul as immortal and believe that they ought to strive, especially to draw near to righteousness. Okay, so the first paragraph says that the Essenes leave everything in the hand of God. This means very strong predestination. Yes, very strong predestination. God determines everything. Our ability to change our fate, limited, very limited. God set our fate in advance. So we can already see some believe in predestination, some don't believe in predestination. I'm going to sum it up eventually in the next slide. So, and they also believe in the afterlife, yes? When we die, our soul remains immortal. We are staying alive. And they are righteous people. They send They sent void offerings to the temple, but performed their sacrifices employing a different ritual purification. For this reason, they are barred from those precedents of temple and are frequented by all the people and perform their rites by themselves. Otherwise, they are of the highest character, devoting themselves solely for agricultural labor. So the Essenes left Jerusalem because they thought the temple was corrupted. So they moved to they moved to the caves in the desert, and they lived in those caves, and they kind of did their rituals differently. And I'm not going to get into what and how and this and that. You can have a whole semester just about that. When I was a student, I took a full semester, just full semester class studying the Essenes, just the Essenes. So there's a lot to say here. But I would just say that they were performing the rituals differently than the temple, and therefore they were considered heretics by the temple. So they viewed the temple, ritual as heretical, and the people in the temple viewed them as heretics. So this kind of the relationship between them. So they didn't go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't come to them, and they sent offerings, on the pilgrimage, but they did not participate in temple ritual, and they were like they're very pious. They were just very religious, and it seems like Josephus really admired them. I'll continue reading. Moreover, they hold their possession in common, and the wealthy man received no more enjoyment from his property than the man who possessed nothing. So this is an interesting point to mention. This was a commune, and if you are familiar with the kibbutz in Israel, this community of people, this has been a primitive example of a kibbutz where all people live together, work together, and they all share the same property. Nobody has his own property. The men who practice this way of life number no more than 4,000. They either bring wives into their community, they're celibates, yes? And this is also another influence on the story of Jesus, yes, who was also a celibate. Nor do they own slaves, since they believe that the latter practice contributes to injustice and that the former opens a way to a source of dissension. Instead, they live by themselves and perform menial tasks for one another. They elect by show of hands good men to receive their revenues and the produce of earth, and priests to prepare bread and other food. So this was a pure communist, a very primitive example of communist community in which everyone are equal. They have no private property, and they decide who their leadership by a vote of hands, and they work. It's a self-sustaining. They were able to feed themselves, and they are very righteous. And okay, so I'm gonna the following paragraph, the immortality of the soul. For it is a fixed belief on theirs that the body is corruptible and it constitute matter impairment, but that the soul is immortal and imperishable. Yes, the body dies, the soul remains. Emanating from the finest ether, these souls become entangled, as it were, in the prison house of the body, to which they are dragged down by the sort of natural spell. This is okay, let's explain it. So they basically say that our body is like a prison to the soul. The soul is what's important. The body is just what's holding the soul in it. The body is corrupt. The body will die. The body is, but the soul will remain. And the soul will remain. But when one are released from the bonds of flesh, then, as though liberated from a long servitude, they rejoice and are borne aloof. Sharing the beliefs of sons of Greece, they maintain that for the virtuous souls there is a reserved an abode beyond the ocean, a place which is not oppressed by rain nor snow or heat, but is refreshed by the ever gentle breath of the west wind coming from the ocean, while they regulate base souls to a mockery and temptatious dungeons, big with never-ending punishments. Okay. So here again we see the concept of, this is very interesting stuff, of heaven and hell. We see it again. There is a place beyond the ocean that is a wonderful place that there's never raining, or there's no snow, and there's just food, and there's just good thing, and there's the good weather, that's what it's a gentle breeze coming from the ocean, like there's a breeze coming from the ocean, a very nice place for good souls. And then for bad souls, there is a dungeon waiting for them, yeah, and for never-ending punishment. So, and the soul is what's important, not the body. The body will die, and then the soul will get to the place where it needs to be, and that's what's important. Just the soul, not the body. So here we read about the three sects of Judaism, according to Josephus, and now we saw some themes that repeat themselves in all of those texts that he wrote about these sects. And I'll try to kind of sum it up as much as I can. Of course, there's a lot to say. So when it comes to the idea of the afterlife, the Sadducees do not believe in afterlife. The Pharisees, according to Josephus, believe in reincarnation. The Essenes believe in heaven and hell. We can see that concepts that later on developed among in the West have been more like the heaven and hell place, kind of all the three ideas of Judaism. And to be honest, the idea that there's no afterlife did not receive a lot of support among any future groups. Now, when it comes to free will, the Sadducees believed in a complete free will. You are responsible for your actions. The Essenes were just the opposite. They believed in complete predestination. God is responsible for everything. The Pharisees took a middle path, mostly predestination, but some free will. By the way, so it's interesting to notice that from one hand, the Essenes believed in strong predestination, but they also believed in heaven and hell, which is kind of like a contradiction, because the idea of heaven and hell is the idea that you are responsible for your actions. If you are bad, you go to hell. If you're good, you go to heaven. Yes, but if you have predestination, you're not responsible for your actions. So there's kind of like a tension here that is unresolved. But But you see the different groups had different opinions on those questions. Now, when it comes to social status, the Sadducees were the elite, the wealthy elite of Jerusalem, but they were not popular among the masses. The Pharisees were the popular group and was the most common among the people. And the Essenes were just a small group that was living in the desert. It didn't have much influence of what was going on, inside Jerusalem or inside other places. They were just, outsiders. They decided to retreat. Regarding the law, the Jewish law, the Sadducees were like what we call today biblical literalists, yes, like some Christian movements that are biblical literalists. If it's written in the Bible, it exists. If it doesn't, we don't care about it. The Pharisees developed a whole set of supplemental oral laws, and that was based on traditions. And the Essenes had their own rituals. They did not follow the rituals of either this or that, had their own rituals. So from those groups, we can see the future developments of both Judaism and later on a religion that will develop from Judaism, which is Christianity. Yes, from the Pharisees, we saw Judaism that we have today, developed from the Pharisees, yes, with the rabbinical literature, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, all of those things. This is the oral law that the Pharisees started developing at that time. From the Sadducees, the literalists, there was a movement. It didn't survive. There are a few groups, there are a few people until today somewhere. They are called the Karaites, Karaim. The Karaites, they follow the literal law. They just follow the literal law. They don't accept the authority of the Talmud. Yes? So this was from the Sadducees, the Karaites were developed. From the Pharisees, the Jewish people have developed. And from the Essenes, we have seen how Christianity has developed. So this is why, those three groups of Judaism has so much significance in the history of world religions and monotheism. And those ideas, those debates about afterlife, about the soul, about the body, about free will, predestination, these are debates that are bothering us, and we are debating them until today. 2,000 years have passed, and we are still asking the same questions, debating the same debates, and those ideas circulate all over, then there are supporters for each of those things. And this is all starting, those conversations begin during Second Temple Judaism and the different movements of Judaism at that time.